President-elect Donald Trump joining Meet the Press on Sunday to detail sweeping changes that he plans to carry out as soon as he takes office in January, including tariffs.
It cost Americans nothing. They made a great economy for us. They also solve another problem. If we were going to have problems having to do with wars and having to do with other things, tariffs, I have stopped wars with tariffs by saying, you guys want to fight, it's great, but both of you are going to pay tariffs to the United States at 100%. And they have many purposes, tariffs, if properly used.
Joining us right now to break down the interview, former White House Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. He is the co-chair of Actum Strategic Advisors, and former U.S. Congresswoman Donna Edwards. Donna, I want to start with you because I was struck by a couple things in this interview, but particularly I was struck by both the measured tone of President-elect Trump and the nuance around a lot of his answers, which were very much in line, actually, with what Jeff Bezos had said last week in terms of how he was thinking about this president. And I was curious if you had the same reaction or not.
Well, I mean, there may have been nuance around some things, but the reality is that on the, sort of really touch-tone issues, there was no nuance at all. In fact, I actually think he was incredibly clear when it came to his plans for mass deportation, for tariffs, some areas of foreign policy. He could not have been clearer. And in fact, in some of these issues, he really doubled down, even on immigration, challenging the idea of birthright citizenship, which I thought was a staggering comment coming from the former president, the president-elect. And so I actually think on some of these issues around immigration and deportation, he was really clear, very precise. And so people are not going to be confused at all about these policies when they come down.
Mick, what did you think of the birthright comment? I think that did get a lot of attention. And if it hasn't gotten attention, maybe it should get more.
Yeah, and I thought it was a nuanced answer. In fact, I think it's a good way to look at it, Andrew, because they didn't get into it last night, but the part of the Constitution that Kristen Welker didn't read said that has to deal with folks who are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And it's unclear right now in our legal system as to what that means, as to whether or not someone who was here illegally can have a child, and whether that child is subject to the jurisdiction and so forth. So I thought it was a nuanced question. Stay within immigration for a second. I thought one of the most important things that came up last night was the comment about the Dreamers. Again, you want to talk about nuance. He didn't talk much about Dreamers on the campaign trail, but it sounds like there might be a deal to be had out there in Washington, D.C., which is Trump is willing to talk about some type of status for the Dreamers in exchange possibly for more assistance on deportation and border security. So, yeah, listen, if you don't like Trump's style, you don't like Trump, you didn't like the interview, I get that. But if you're looking for hints of what the second term would look like, I did think there were some interesting sort of things to look at yesterday during the interview.
Mick, let me just ask you one question as it relates to tariffs, which is, we constantly talk about tariffs and maybe this is a negotiating tool. This isn't just a plan across the board. He suggested that again in the interview to some degree. But the truth is, if you know it's a negotiating tool, how strong a tool actually is it? Because if the other side knows that you genuinely actually don't want to pursue these tariffs and that there's pressure clearly on the other side, how much leverage do you really have?
That's pretty easy, isn't it? It just depends on the credible threat of actually doing it. And I think that Mexico believes there's a credible threat that Trump would put on the tariffs. Look, when you talk about the tariffs, he said, what did he say? They can mean many different things. And I think that's right. I think a tariff, Andrew, on American steel for the purpose of protecting, for example, the United States Steel Corporation, that's one kind of tariff. A threatened tariff on Mexico to try to get leverage over them to change their immigration policy or their drug flow policy, that's something else. So when you ask a question about Donald Trump and tariffs, my response is always, well, which ones and for what purpose? Because there's a broad spectrum of how these particular tools can be used, and you have to sort of look at them on a case-by-case basis.
Right. Donna, what did you make of his comments? We were talking about actually in the 6 o'clock hour with Eamon Javers around Jay Powell. There's been a lot of talk about the independence of the Fed. He suggested that, firing Jay Powell was not on the table per se today. Said it wasn't something that he intended to do. And yet then there became this sort of back and forth about, well, I think if I asked him to step down, he wouldn't. But if I told him to step down, he would, and what that means.
Well, I mean, I thought that was very confusing, and I think deliberately so. I think the president-elect realizes that it could be very destabilizing to announce outright that he's either, firing or asking Jay Powell to step down. But I suspect that, as we come to, a point, there was a time during the campaign season where, in fact, President Trump actually did talk about removing, and his ability as president to remove the head of the Fed. And so I wouldn't put that off the table, but I think he recognizes that could be destabilizing to the markets, and he was treading quite carefully. And frankly, I mean, I think more troubling was just his conversation about tariffs. To be quite honest, I just really don't see how that won't result in anything but a negative impact on American consumers.
Right. Hey, Mick, let me ask you for your help with this, because I was watching the other part of the interview where he talked about potentially, someone like a Liz Cheney he thinks should go to jail. And he was sort of quizzed on this, said it wasn't something he was doing, but then also suggested maybe the FBI should do it. I mean, there was sort of a back and forth about that. We've talked a lot about weaponizing the Justice Department. He's been very critical, obviously, of this Biden administration for that particular issue. Clearly, there are Democrats who are very worried that he would weaponize it. What was your give me the generous view, give me the critical view, as somebody who I think has watched and knows the president-elect.
Let me see if I can shoot it down the middle between generous and critical. I didn't like it very much. I don't like that language, especially when it's aimed towards other elected officials. At the same time, I think if you look at the transcript, and I did, it says things if they've done something wrong, if they've done something illegal, et cetera, et cetera. For example, he went into the allegations regarding the committee, the J6 committee destroying evidence, which would be against the law and so forth. So if you're looking for nuance, if you're looking for subtlety, you can find it. I don't like the language very much.